So, a computer needs memory to store and retrieve both data and instructions. However, the road to get there wasn't overnight. In this video, we'll be talking about primary, secondary, and tertiary memory, as well as going a bit into depth into various memory types, such as RAM and DDR, ROMs, and hard drives. So what exactly is computer memory? Well, it's any component that's meant to hold data or instructions either permanently or temporarily. You've got primary memory, which is usually volatile memory that's meant to be temporary until the power goes off, such as RAM, which is random access memory, and cache memory. SRAM, static RAM, that's usually used with cache memory. Dynamic RAM, that's usually used with RAM. Um, Secondary is usually non-volatile memory that's meant for more permanent storage, magnetic storage, optical storage, flash memory. And then you've got the concept of tertiary memory, and this is really archival or backup. It could be long-term magnetic tapes, cloud storage, etc. Microcontroller ICs tend to be described in their SRAM as their primary, flash as their secondary, and maybe even EEPROM capabilities if they have it. And then tertiary memory is just really the fact that you have the code backed up in Arduino or whatever, since it usually can't be retrieved from the microcontroller itself. There's always exceptions to this category, such as non-volatile RAM, or something linked to a small battery, your basic BIOS, CMOS, UE, FI settings, little clock battery in there to keep those. So let's go back and just talk about the history of memory, generally speaking. Well, in the 1700s and then in the 1800s, punch cards started to become a thing. They were used with looms to create patterns. So basically, they were the earliest form of instruction memory, secondary, I guess, in this case. By the late 19th century, punch cards and punch tape were used to tabulate the US Census, and they found other applications. Why this was done was the 1880 US Census took about 8 years to finish. Part of that was the antiquated techniques and the fact that the population of the United States was growing almost exponentially. Whereas they switched to a tabulator and punch cards in for the 1891, and I think it might have just taken a couple of months, maybe a little sooner than that. It would have had to have been at least a couple of months. Um, Skip ahead to the 1930s, 40s. That's where electromagnetic memory started to become a thing. Bits were stored in electromagnetic relays, which were already a technology at this time. At the same time, in the 40s, the late 40s, really early 50s, you had a thing called delay line memory that used sound waves and mercury, a really far out technology that didn't last that long, but it was used on the UNIVAC 1. And then also at the same time, in the late 40s, we had the Williams tube, also known as the Williams-Kilburn tube, I believe. It was the first practical example of random access memory. It basically just stored bits as charged spots on a cath-through ray tube, but you could access any point of that memory, which is a very important concept. Late 40s to 50s, the development of magnetic drum memory, basically the precursor to magnetic hard drives. Skip ahead a little bit, and you had magnetic core memory, which was a lot smaller. It stored each bit in a ferrite core ring, and they were kind of all threaded together in a grid. Believe it or not, this was actually dominant memory for nearly 2 decades. Spacecraft, everything used this. But by the 1960s, we started to see semiconductor memory that led to modern RAM types, SRAM, DRAM. We also saw memory become much more subdivided with different technologies for registers, RAM, ROM, hard drives, etc. By starting in the 70s, but really getting a foothold more in the 90s, you start to see optical memory. CDs really weren't super, all that, and laser discs. The average person, even a computer user, didn't necessarily have them. By the 90s, they were pretty much everywhere, and then DVDs and Blu-ray developed from there. Starting in 1980, flash memory was a thing, although it didn't really get started until the 90s, and that led to SSDs, flash drives, SD cards, the whole kit and caboodle. Now, some of those you know, but I thought I'd bring up a few pictures. Here's a Jacquard machine punch card. I think it's in a museum in Scotland. But yeah, the twisted threads would be affected by these giant punch card thing. From there, I mean, he wasn't the only one who did this, but he popularized it. And it basically made so you could essentially print books using a loom, made it very powerful. Then stopping ahead here, there was a lot of different card punches out there. This is a panographic one. Um, and yeah, you just moved the handle around to each of the points and you just pressed it and it would, the actual punch card is on the top and it's pantographed so that it was easier for the operator to use the handle spread out over a much larger area. And these only got better and more complicated as the years went on. Eventually, they became electric, and you could just have a key punch. You just enter the on a keypad. And those things, I mean, they probably existed in some form for well over decades. Hell, there's probably a few of them sitting around in the 70s or 80s for that. Well, definitely the 70s, probably into the 80s, maybe longer than that. So next we have electromagnetic relays. This is a whole big bank of them. I don't think this is technically a computer, maybe something with the phone lines, but you kind of get the idea. You'd have big banks of these, and then they could each one of these could store 0 or 1. And then we had the Williams tube. There's a lot of different pictures of this. Basically, kind of looks like a bowling pin with a flatter bottom. But yeah, it's still based on a cathode ray tube. That white you see, if it was a if it is a cathode ray tube, but that would be where the picture shows. Some of these would have phosphor coverings, so that sorry, coatings that would you'd actually see individual dots. A lot of them didn't, and they were held in these containers anyways, so it really didn't matter. And then their magnetic drum memory became a thing throughout the 50s. There were even machines well through the 60s that also used that. Basically, be a rotating drum, and this is kind of the precursor to hard drives or magnetic hard drives, anyways. And then here's the interesting magnetic core memory. Sometimes it's called ring memory, but it is literally little metal rings in little grids here, threaded together with wires. Now, people wonder, why don't we just use one technology for the other? And the big thing here is access times. Now, starting with CPU registers, those are the fastest thing. They're usually just 1 bit. I think there's 60 odd ones on a given CPU core. Um, there's specific ones. I decided not to go into too much detail there, but literally a fraction of a nanosecond. So we're talking picoseconds at that point. Now, if everything could access times like that, it would be great. Everything would just be instantaneous. Um, and then we have our cache memory, which is static RAM. Level 1, level 2, level 3. You'll see the access times go up, but they're still pretty reasonable. And then you've got your DRAM. That's going to be your RAM on your computer. It's still in nanoseconds. Now keep in mind with DRAM, it has to refresh, and that's actually more in milliseconds, but that's beside the point. I have a category here for persistent memory. A lot of other memory technologies, this is kind of where they sat, like those Williams tubes. The ley line was a lot slower though. And then we have our NV ME solid state drives that are becoming, they're very popular. Most computers nowadays tend to have one sitting directly in an M2 socket on the motherboard. It might just be your basic hard drive, or it may be the thing that's running everything. Like on my computer right now, I have a 1 terabyte one of those as my primary hard drive, and that's microseconds. It's not nanoseconds, but still pretty good, especially when you compare it to the rest. So with SATA is slower. NVMe is like twice as fast. And then you move to SD cards, like the most high-end SDXC ones. They're now measured in milliseconds of accuracy. We've gone from micro to milli. And then a USB flash drive is about half that speed. And then we've got conventional magnetic hard drives that were in all computers for decades. They've been phased out. They're phasing out, but you still will find them. like 7,200 RPM, it's going to be 515 milliseconds. So 54 is going to be 10 to 20. And they were even slower than that if you go back far enough in time. But still, the whole point here is they're a lot slower than RAM, a lot slower than other things, even the flash drive. CD-ROMs, now this could vary between speeds because that's how they used to measure them. 1, 2, 3, 40, whatever. I don't remember numbers going over like 48 eventually. It was fast enough. But yeah, still in milliseconds and like 10 times slower than a hard drive. DVD-ROMs even slower, Blu-ray as well. At this point, we're almost hitting seconds. Now, I'm saying magnetic archives, but this technology to change it drastically over time. So it could have been seconds, minutes, potentially hours to back up something depending on the specific technology. That's why I have three asterisks there. It's at various points, and even now, it's a lot faster. And then technically, printouts, they are a form of tertiary memory. You just print out, say, all your computer code. That could be minutes on a modern printer. Actually, maybe even seconds or minutes. And then you have to think also manually typing something, input it. So if somebody gives you a printout of a program, our data, how fast can you put that in? And that could vary from 150 to 250 milliseconds, depending on your typing speed. Keep in mind, it's a human, so we only have so much endurance. We can't go at it for literal days without stopping. We got to pause, we got to rest our fingers, eat, drink, sleep, etc. So let's start talking about primary memory. Its definition is really any memory that can be directly accessed by the CPU without loading it from a storage device. The definition kind of varies between just RAM or RAM registers and caches. I've already mentioned that RAM is random access memory, and the definition of machine. This is different from Turing machine. Turing machine makes no difference, sees no difference between primary and secondary memory. Everything's on an imaginary tape. A RAM machine was the idea that you have a type of memory where you can access any bit of information on it. Turing machine was completely sequential. You could move it around. You could move it to different. You could move the tape back and forth so many places, but you couldn't just necessarily randomly. Depending on your definition, there is an idea of jumping, but it's not quite the same as random access memory. You can read and write to any point. Now, CPU registers, we mentioned those being the fastest thing, just very tiny bits of data, sometimes just a bit on the CPU, and there can be 40, 50, 60 different ones. And then we have caches, relatively small amounts of SRAM on or near the CPU, divided into level 1, level 2, level 3. There's a limited form of level 4, but we'll get into that. Early computers, as I said, they didn't really specialize memory. Memory was generally memory. If you go to ENAC, it was just a bunch of shift registers and flip-flops, and then everything was inputted or outputted. It was just memory was essentially more of a scratch pad to put in values. And then it started to specialize starting in the 1950s, moving into the 60s, so that by the time we hit the 70s, we had memory specialized between primary and secondary. Um, there are some examples of concept of primary memory being non-volatile, but nowadays, usually when we talk about primary memory, it's volatile. However, research has been ongoing to create viable non-volatile RAM using a number of different technologies. So in 10, 20 years, the statement that primary memory is always volatile could change. And then we move on to secondary memory. This is meant for long-term data storage that isn't directly accessed by the CPU. It's loaded into primary memory where it can be used by the CPU. It is non-volatile by modern definition, so it doesn't lose the data with loss of power. Magnetic hard drives, they started to become commercially available in 1956. And by 73, they were using the Winchester architecture. And basically, that's where modern magnetic hard drives began. In 1980, the first one for personal computers was available. I think it was Stuttgart and 10 megabytes, but there were some very niche hard drives around the same time, so there possibly was something smaller. The first floppy disk came out sort of between 67, 71, and they became staples of secondary memory for computers by I want to say the mid to late 70s. Saw a sharp decline by the 2000s because it got replaced by flash memory. Then flash memory technically was invented in the 1980s, but it really didn't become a viable product until the 90s. By the 2000s, there were solid state hard drives, so no more magnetic platters, no more spinning motor. Um, and then eventually, more recently, you had the NVMe protocol. Solid state drives are even faster, and they've become incredibly popular especially when they're in the M2 form factor. Um, Optical media came out in the 70s technically, and then you saw development and widespread use in the 80s, but it was still a sort of rich man's game. And then once the 90s hit, everybody had CD players, and then eventually DVD, Blu-ray, and so on. Then we come to tertiary memory. This is a little bit more of a concept versus a strict set of technologies. It's basically long-term memory storage for archival purposes. This could be as simple as saving a bunch of printouts together, or you could be committing that data to something like microfiche, scanning it in. This was also very common. And then we moved to more data, I guess, basically data magnetic tapes, so that you'd have big tapes that you would just back up the data on. It could be pretty slow, but at least you had it. This technology actually still exists, is still used. They've just improved upon it. Um, and then I want to say starting in the 90s, you had optical media jukeboxes, and you would just have these huge stacks of CDs that you could burn to, save, etc. Nowadays, you also have cloud storage. Um, the chief idea behind tertiary memory used to be the data is not immediately available, it's not readily available, and you really only have to look at it infrequently. I mean, these are things that could take quite a while. It might be, I need this bit of archival information, and the other person would be like, this will take me a couple of weeks, a couple of days. um, when it was analog technology, it could easily be a couple of weeks while somebody searched logs of what was in what microfiche, and then it became days, and then it was like overnight. Um, Now, the idea is if the entire computer is lost, including any attached storage devices, you've got tertiary memory. Although definitions are really blurring with cloud storage. You can pretty much access your cloud data instantly. So is it still tertiary memory? Technically, yes. This is one of those things like how we call primary volatile, secondary non-volatile. That can change over time and it can definitely blur. Now, we've talked about RAM, and what that is has changed a little bit, but since the 70s, we're really talking about either SRAM or DRAM. SRAM is static, D is dynamic. So what's the difference? Well, SRAM consists of a flip-flop circuit to store one bit of information. However, it needs 6 transistors to do that. You're doing this for one bit of information, not all the more expensive. You're talking about kilobytes. You're talking, that's 8,000 approximate bits. You're talking about mega, it's 8 million, giga. You get the idea of how expensive that can get. DRAM, on the other hand, uses a capacitor and just one transistor for each bit, but the charge that's in the capacitor has to be regularly refreshed. Nowadays, that's measured in milliseconds, I think. Um, but the price difference is the biggest sticking point. SRAM, this could be as high as $500 to $5,000 USD per gigabyte, while DRAM could be as low as $2 to $10 per gigabyte. Although with market RAM prices right now, it's DRAM is inflated by like two to two and a half times. So we usually use SRAM for caches. Um, and then DRAM for the main computer RAM. Technologies have improved, but actually the price gap has gotten bigger over the decades. I mean, we're in some cases we're looking at a factor of 1,000. This is more to do with DRAM prices coming down versus SRAM necessarily being more expensive, but it is a mixture of the two. But this gap was still big enough in the 70s that they had to pick. DRAM was more complex because of the refresh. You had to set up a refresh circuit, but it's still that's what they picked for computer RAM. SRAM was used in certain applications where the larger size, because it is a bigger circuit, the expense beat out the need to refresh it. If you looked at things like the Altair 8800, it had both SRAM and DRAM RAM boards, because that's actually how you put RAM into a S100 bus, whereas the DRAM would be considerably bigger than the SRAM. Um, DRAM for the longest time was asynchronous from like the 70s through the 90s. You had Edo RAM, which I remember, FPM, Beto. There were other kinds. It's all a little hazy for me. Eventually, synchronous DRAM came out in the 90s. For the longest time, it was SDRAM. So if you see that mentioned to you where it's not static dynamic, it's synchronous DRAM. It's still a type of DRAM. And then the real kicker was when DDR came out, and that's double data rate. Came out in the early 2000s, and nowadays, if there's RAM in a computer or a smart device or something, it is probably this, whereas again, SRAM for caches with the CPU. There are low power variants, those are used for smart devices, SPCs, etc. They're not as powerful as the main line. And then there's actually specialized variants. Like one of the big ones is for graphics processing, but there's a couple of other types also being used, but I'm not going to cover them in this video. So I'm just going to go to double two transfers per clock cycle, and then previous SDRAM could only do one. Typically, the full name of it is DDR SDRAM. Nobody calls it that. First generation came out around 2000. They stopped production in roughly 2000. Keep in mind, people don't just change ish. Uh, 200 to 400. Clock speed is half that usually, so 100 to 200 megahertz. Um, it started as low as 128 megabytes, uh, to 1 gig, 2. And the voltage it ran at was 2.5. That's actually important. Next generation came out and it, 2009, but machines were still running it for years after it. And basically a big increase across the board. Now forward almost more than 1,000. Same thing with the clock rate. You started to see a bigger, wider gap of clock rate. The amount that it was available in um, went, but also importantly, the voltage that the power consumption was down. Um, Third generation came out. That's used, we'll still see that in plenty. They stopped kind of producing, but we're going to see it in a lot of stuff. Um, Usual increases and everything. Now, kind of 1 gigabyte, 16 and 32. Higher end machines, but you don't see it as often with DDR3. Again, the voltage goes down. Fourth gen is definitely still around everywhere. Not everybody has been able to immediately upgrade to fifth gen. They might even still be actually still producing it. But yeah, the usual increases, it's just going up to a factor. Um, During all of this, you're going to see different DDR sticks at different clock speeds, and you kind of have to match them. And then all the technologies to take advantage of, the motherboard has to support it. Um, my last computer was DDR4, I believe. That sounds about right. But yeah, 4 to 32 gigabytes. But it went further up than that. There's high-end niche cases where 256, 512. I'm not suggesting anybody go out and pawn their new car to buy a stick of this kind of RAM. It is generally not worth it. Your motherboard probably doesn't even support it either. And then we have our current generation. That's the fifth generation. That's what my current computer has. If you buy new devices, it'll probably be some variation of this. It came out in 2021, so it's been out long enough. Um, but yeah, same idea. And the voltage just keeps going down. We've also got a variant known as LPDDR. That means low power. It came out just a little after DDR generation came, and the generations sort of mirror normal DDR. They're basically used in smaller devices, laptops, smartphones, etc. That's one of the things that makes all those devices possible. The big thing is their power consumption is roughly half of that of the corresponding generation. So if it uses like 1.2, it uses around half to zero point 0.6, give or take. Keep in mind it also generates less heat. That is becoming far more of an issue with DDR5. Just a few years ago, the idea that you needed to cool your RAM was kind of a pipe dream. Now it's starting to become a thing. Um, it's usually soldered on. It's not something it's meant to be upgraded. So you're not just going to find RAM sticks of it, but I'm sure somewhere there's something. Key thing is instead of a single wide channel, it's multiple smaller channels. That's how it can generate less heat. Its capabilities are roughly a generation behind its corresponding DDR generation. So DDR5X, sort of comparable to 4, give or take. Mind you, that gap has been steadily closing. So LPDDR is starting to really compete with lower end regular DDR. We also had DDR, and that's just graphical. First came out in 2004 to provide some solid DDR RAM for discrete graphics cards. Its generations are not in sync with the rest of DDR, kind of has its own numbering. Its design is multiple wide lanes working in parallel relatively with the GPU, you're working with thousands of cores doing relatively small but numerous tasks, and GDDR has to work with that. Now, power consumption, really big factor. It consumes power, generates a lot of heat because of what it's doing. So you're not going to see it in small devices. So size, heat, expense, etc. Um, the first again came out in 2004 by GDDR5. You saw that in PlayStation 4s, and it just kept going up from there. For the most part, right now, your cards will probably be GDDR6, maybe maybe still 5 or 5X, more likely 5X, but also 6X for the better graphics cards out there. 7 is just kind of sort of coming out. It's next generation stuff. There's a huge bandwidth leap. In a few more years, you might start to have a computer that has this. I'm not going to go into as much detail with this. I just wanted to let people be aware of what it is. All right, let's go into Falstead, and this is what static RAM basically looks like. I didn't make this. In this case, it's actually, we're doing 2 bits here and count the transistors. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And this, I'm not entirely sure if these inverting gates, this might just be part of this circuit. But yeah, you got 6 up here, you got 6 down here. Um, okay, so the top one is considered 1, the bottom one's considered 1. Um, so we could set it to a 0 or 1. So let's go data, I don't know, let's make it a 0. All right. Now this is a 0 bottom there. Let's go to the top. Well, let's make that a 0 as well. Okay, let's change it. Now it's high. So it's a 1 here, 0 there. Switch, you'll see the data. It's pretty simple. Multiply this by a couple of billion times and you get an idea for the cost and the size. All right, now we're coming into dynamic RAM. And in this case, we have 4 bits. And you'll notice each one has a capacitor, each one has a transistor. So simpler, but you have to refresh. Now everything, this is a simulator, so there's not an idea of we're going to lose data here. But yeah, we start with, let's see, which one? Okay, all right, so 0, 0, and then I'm guessing, okay, that's 0, 1. All right, so we're looking at the very bottom one. I mean, we can refresh. I'm not sure how much it's going to do, but it's currently set to 1. We'll set it low. We're right. There we go. Let's move to the next one. Let's set that low. It's already low. Okay. Let's go to the next one. Whoops. Okay. And then the last one, which is already low, but there we go. So it's 4 zeros now. Um, let's move to, well, we'll start with the top. Let's set to high. We're right. Let's do that one as, so now we've got 0, 1, 0, 1. All right. And just moving it through, we can tell what's in each of those. Again, there is a refresh line. How much that's going to matter at this scale on the simulator, I don't know, but there you go. And then we have cache memory. This was something that didn't exist on CPUs initially. It's something that started to build up in the 80s, but level one, that's on each CPU core. Keep in mind, modern CPUs can be running anything from 4 to 8, typically, maybe even 16 kilobytes per core, but it's basically the fastest thing of anything on your computer that's not a CPU register. Level two, usually each CPU core has it. In some designs, some of them are shared between cores, more kilobytes going into like megabyte range. A lot of the work it does is essentially kind of a backup for level one. Now, I don't mean in the same way of like a data backup. I mean, if level one needs to go back on a task to do the next thing of it, then it could be, the overall task could be in level two, and then level one is doing each individual step, something kind of along those lines. And then we have level three. This is always shared between cores, as far as I know. It's in the megabyte range, and it's basically there as a memory for all the work that's done between the cores, because there are certain things, obviously, that an individual core doesn't do on its own. And then we have level four. This is a little stranger and it's rare. Maybe one day we'll see this more, but it sits completely outside the CPU die. And it's either embedded DRAM or an entirely different chip. This is really just to provide an extra big buffer between the CPU and the RAM. Again, it's kind of rare. Now, caches can be instruction or data or unified, and this goes back to Harvard versus Princeton or von Neumann architecture. Um, you're gonna with level one, you're gonna see separate caches, probably instruction and data. With level two and three, you're probably going to see unified. And in previous videos, I mentioned how modern computers are neither one architecture or the other. They are a wide mixture of both. And then, so since it's so ubiquitous in life now, I'm going to talk about flash memory. This is any solid state memory that is non-volatile, fast. That's why they call it flash, durable, reliable, power efficient, compact. The concept was developed in the 1980s as a replacement for all the limitations, difficulties you had with magnetic storage. First chip came out in 88 using NOR. NAND came out 2 years later. SanDisk, the company, they were founded in 1995. I still remember reading magazine articles from when they were founded. And they basically popularized USB drives, memory cards, etc. And then it took things a step further. They made NAND solid state drives that came out in 2004, and a lot of different advantages over traditional magnetic ones. There's a good chance you're using a computer right now that does not have a traditional magnetic hard drive, and to me, that makes me feel old. So early solid state was very restricted when it came out. I can remember it was basically treated as sort of a better replacement for writable CDs because they could do at least a couple hundred writes and at least a few thousand reads, maybe more than that. Um, Although the price point wasn't the greatest at the time, you were paying a lot for something that was only marginally better than a writable CD, but there were definitely use cases, especially in like archival work. But modern solid state memory usually can write and read millions of times at this point. They're effectively infinite. Um, by that, I mean you could use one at least for 5 years and you'd probably be fine. Now you'll see SD, SDHC, XC, UD cards mentioned, and I'm mentioning them in the micro form, but essentially they're all the same. It's just the form factor. They're used for secondary memory, smartphones, single board computers, etc. Um, they're another option from USB flash drives, and they are faster. The original SD standard only went up to 2 GB, which at that time was huge. That could effectively back up a hard drive at the time, if I recall correctly. And then HC came out that could go up to 32 gigabytes, which is still they're still made today. But yeah, 32 gigabytes is nothing nowadays. XC goes up to 2 terabytes, And the newest standard, UC, can in theory go all the way up to 120 terabytes, which for the most part outside of data centers, you're not going to see those sizes. But again, in theory, we could be easily looking at terabyte cards being um, very viable and I won't say cheap, but not expensive. And then there's MMC. That's another standard that SD overtook going into the 2000s, where you'll probably still see it. You'll still see the cards. They still make the cards. And those cards, in some cases, like there's certain applications where you have to use them. But you'll see embedded MMC with sizes up to about half the size of SATA SSDs. The Arduino Uno Q uses one. And now we come to ROM, which is read-only memory. Now, this is from the original limitation that it was constructed at a factory. They made a particular die, they produced whatever chips, and it couldn't be changed afterwards. If you wanted a new ROM or you needed more of the old one, they had to bring out the die again. There was a good chance they got rid of it, maybe. If they had to make a newly constructed one for something, yeah, that got extremely expensive. And then came proms from, I don't know, somewhere in the 1960s. You could make a generic ROM. You could just make generic ones the live long day, and then you could program it later for whatever purpose. Obviously, at this point, it sort of blew apart the definition of read-only memory, but the name had already stuck. They weren't going to change it. ROM prices sank quickly and drastically. Companies that could not afford them now could just get them by the thousands. Individuals could even get them now. Um, and then you had EEPROM, which is erasable programmable ROM. Those came out in the 70s, and you could erase them through long-term exposure to UV light, and then you could reprogram them. There is conflicting stories to whether or not at that point individual users could reprogram them, or you had to send them back to the factory. And then we have EEPROMs, which are still just kind of called EEPROMs. These are electrically erasable programmable ROM, and those became popularized in the 80s. Um, Here you can both erase them and reprogram versus a usually pretty small electric programmer by the user. As I said, ROM name just kind of stayed regardless of the fact that technically after a certain point they weren't ROMs. And you'll see them on all sorts of uses, and you can get EEPROM modules to use with your microcontroller. Keep in mind they do have they're a type of flash memory, or flash memory is a type of them. So yeah, it's not meant to be just constantly used like a hard drive, but access amounts times these days, you're probably fine. And they're so cheap that if one goes out on you, you can probably replace it for pennies on the dollar. So there's a lot of different EPROMs available to hobbyists. We've got ones that can be accessed through I2C. These do tend to be very small but very cheap. They can go all the way down to a kilobit. Actually, I think they can go even further than that, um, and up to a megabit. So you're not going to see big values with these, but they're cheap. We've also got ones that be accessed through SPI. These tend to be a little bigger, but more expensive. Another thing I found, they're far less likely to be available in DIP packages, so keep that in mind. They're usually higher capacity, but at this point, they're technically not being considered EPROMs anymore. They're basically NOR flash chips. There's also parallel EPROMs. I really haven't encountered those. They're even more expensive, less common. But from what I can tell, the sizes are still comparable to them. So I'm guessing access times and such is the advantage here. There's also rare types. There's microwire, which uses three wires. Uno O, that's a single wire, which is different than one wire. SM bus. Ken and Lin have their own ones. You probably won't encounter these much, at least not as directly accessible EPROMs. I mean, you're probably using plenty of this when you drive to the convenience store in a modern car, but um, now in earlier computer models, ROMs were usually there to hold instructions for BIOS, etc. The problem with that is Mr. Average Computer User did not have programmers or the knowledge how to upgrade these things, much less where to get them. So if you needed to upgrade your BIOS, fix your BRAS, you had to take it to the local computer shop, and in some cases get charged an arm and a leg. Eventually, this got replaced by programmable flash memory. So now, if you need new updates to your UEFI, you can just download it and let the computer do the rest of the work. Another place you're going to find it is on a lot of AVR chips like the Atmega 328P. They've included an onboard EEPROM. It's meant to hold small amounts of information, calibration data, settings, device IDs. That's because flash memory is extremely limited. So again, bits count. If you can put them somewhere else that's non-volatile, all the better. But it also had the secondary effect that hobbyists that picked up the Arduino Uno and other models could work directly with an EEPROM without attaching an external module. There is a downside to that. If you finally used up your EEPROM's write cycles, that's a useless part to the MCU. I guess in some cases that is a use case for having a socketed at Mega 328P on the Uno Rev 3. You could just replace it out with something else because you've used up the EEPROM, I guess. Um, Other MCUs, you don't tend to see them with other microcontrollers. They got phased out. The main reason is a lot more flash memory, a lot more memory in general. And you can, if you need to emulate an EEPROM, you can do it in flash memory in the program. Um, like if you're moving an Arduino sketch, I guess, that stores that information. um, the big thing here is the EEPROM took up a lot of space on the die, and it could just be used for other things. That also included the hardware for actually interfacing with it. It took up a surprising amount of room. Hello. All right, we're in Walkwe, and I've made a sketch just to check out the internal EEPROM. Now, keep in mind, obviously, this is on a simulator. It doesn't have any of the inherent issues you could have with the internal EEPROM. It assumes everything works. It has infinite reads and writes. There's obviously at some point you can't write or update to the internal EEPROM anymore. It's really not meant to be for that. On the chip, it's really just meant to save certain settings to free up memory, user calibration data, maybe some other details. But yeah, basically it's going to do a couple of things. It's going to get its size, so it's going to length. It's using a library here, EEPROM.h, that's specifically for the internal EEPROM as far as I remember. So it's going to get its length, and then it's going to write to address. It's going to write 1 byte, a value between, which is going to be a value between 0 and 255, because that's all we can put into 1 byte. That's 8 bits. I'm going to write 123 into it. We're going to specify that's what we did. We're then going to read it, and this value should be the same if everything's working. And then we're doing update. Now, update is special. It's only going to write if the value is different. This because otherwise, if you put write like say into a loop, that could be an issue. Um, so basically update, it'll update, it does the update and then it reads to make sure that's right. And then here we're actually putting stuff into a structure that we've defined up here. So the structure is going to have int value, float value, and name, so that it's 3 different data types just to show that off. Um, so coming back down here. Now what this is gonna, let's see, where are we? What this is gonna demonstrate is basically multi-byte data. Stuff doesn't have to just be 1 byte. So yeah, we're using put to write the entire structure, which again is gonna be multi-byte. We got 3 values in there. We're writing it. We're gonna confirm that it wrote. Then we're gonna get, so we're actually gonna get the whole structure back. We're gonna show off the 3 bits in that structure. And then we're just doing a quick loop of showing what's in the first 20 bytes of the EEPROM. We can do this for 100. I think believe the EEPROM, I can't remember how big. Oh yeah, I think the EEPROM is 1024 bytes, and obviously listing all of that would be kind of crazy. but it could, in theory, be done. All right, let's start it up again, see what happens. Okay, let's go through the results. Demo starting. Here's our size, 1024. We're writing, we're reading, we get the value back. We're doing an update, we're getting the update value back. We're doing a put, whereas we're doing the entire struct. We're getting the entire struct, we're listing the values. We had an int, a float, and a name in there. And then we're going to show the first 20 bytes. Now, keep in mind, address 0, we had earlier, we had set it to 200, so that's right. Let's see, what else? Address 10, let's look at what that's going to show. All right, that's showing a 42, so that's the first bit in our strut. And it says 0 and 11, but actually, shouldn't that be 10, 11, it should be 42. Yeah. Oh yeah, it's listing them as, I think yeah, it's just reading. All right. Um, yeah, we would have to do a get if we didn't want just these basic numbers, but that should give you an idea of how the internal EEPROM works. So I just threw a lot of information at you, so let's just wrap up by recapping. Computer memory is any component that can store data or instructions and be accessed by a CPU, or a computer, I really should say. We've talked about primary, secondary, tertiary concepts versus how we implement them. Primary would be, CPU registers, caches, RAM, all volatile memory. Secondary is your hard disks, floppy disks, CDs, flash drives, etc. Those are non-volatile. Tertiary is more of a concept of backup and archive. How that's changed has changed over the years. Historically, memory, it went from punch cards to tape to just wildly different technologies, and then as implementations of more set technologies. We had a more firmer idea what was RAM, hard disk, etc. Access times vary greatly to just fractions of a nanosecond with CPU registers to minutes, even longer in some cases. Primary and secondary memory, originally there wasn't a difference. They got specialized so that, RAM caches, registers, primary, hard drives, floppies, etc. is secondary. We talked about the difference between static and dynamic RAM, especially that huge wallet inflating price difference. We talked about how SDRAM and how that's synchronized DRAM, and that took over really in the 90s. And then in the 2000s, we moved to DDR. And then we talked about low power DDR and graphics DDR, and there's other types as well. We talked about the original magnetic hard drives that dominated for so long. We moved into, in the 2000s, we moved into solid state drives, and then we've had the solid state drives that don't use SATA anymore. They use NVMe, which gives you about twice the speed. We also talked about SD cards and how those are technically used as a hard drive, and and also the competing MMC technology. Talked about ROMs, PROMs, EEPROMs, and EEPROMs. Um, we also talked about the internal EEPROM on the 18 mega 328p. You can check it out if you have an Uno R3. Well, until next time, have a good one.